The morning sun cast long shadows across the ornate courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Donald Trump stepped out of his black limousine. The former president had arrived in London for what his staff described as an unofficial diplomatic visit, though many wondered what business he had at the royal residence without any formal invitation from the Crown. Trump adjusted his red tie and surveyed the magnificent architecture before him. The palace guards stood at attention in their iconic red uniforms and tall black hats, their faces expressionless as they maintained their posts. To Trump, the scene felt familiar yet different from his days in the White House, where military personnel would snap to attention and offer crisp salutes whenever he passed. His entourage of security personnel and advisors followed closely behind as he approached the palace entrance. The British protocol officer who had been assigned to guide the visit walked nervously beside him, clearly uncomfortable with the irregular nature of the proceedings. Trump had insisted on this visit during his European business trip, claiming he had important matters to discuss with palace officials. As they walked through the gates, Trump's eyes fixed on a young palace guard standing rigidly at his post. The guard, barely 25 years old, had been serving the crown for 3 years and took immense pride in his duties. His uniform was immaculate, every button polished to perfection, and his bearing spoke of the discipline instilled through months of training. Trump slowed his pace as he approached the guard, expecting the same military courtesies he had grown accustomed to during his presidency. In his mind, respect and authority were universal concepts that transcended borders and institutions. He had met with queens, kings, and prime ministers, who had all extended appropriate deference to his former office. The palace guard remained motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead as protocol demanded. He had been briefed on the visitor's arrival, but had received clear instructions about maintaining proper procedures. His duty was to the crown and the crown alone, a responsibility that had been drilled into him since his first day of service. Trump stopped directly in front of the guard, his presence commanding attention from the small group of tourists and staff members nearby. The moment felt charged with expectation, as if something significant was about to unfold. The former president stood there for several seconds, his eyes studying the young man's disciplined stance and professional demeanor. The British protocol officer sensed the tension building and stepped forward slightly, ready to intervene if necessary. He had dealt with many high-profile visitors over the years, but this situation felt particularly delicate. The rules governing palace protocol were centuries old and non-negotiable, regardless of who was making the request. Trump's bodyguards positioned themselves strategically around the area, their trained eyes scanning for any potential security concerns. They had witnessed similar scenes during Trump's presidency, where military personnel would immediately acknowledge his presence with proper military honors. This felt different, though none of them could quite articulate why. The morning air was crisp and still, broken only by the distant sounds of London traffic and the occasional click of tourist cameras. The palace guard's breathing was steady and controlled, his training allowing him to maintain perfect composure even as he became the center of an increasingly awkward situation. Trump's expression began to shift from expectation to mild confusion. He was accustomed to immediate recognition of his status and authority, and the guard's continued stillness seemed almost disrespectful to him. The former president glanced around at his entourage, as if seeking confirmation that others were witnessing this apparent breach of protocol. The young guard's thoughts remained focused on his duties and training. He had stood watch through countless ceremonies, state visits, and public events, always maintaining the same professional standard regardless of who passed by. His loyalty was absolute and unwavering, directed solely toward the monarchy he had sworn to serve and protect. Trump cleared his throat loudly, a sound that echoed slightly off the palace walls. The gesture was deliberate, designed to draw the guard's attention and signal his presence more forcefully. He had used similar tactics countless times in business meetings and political encounters, where commanding attention was often the first step toward establishing dominance. The palace guard's eyes remained fixed on the horizon, his training overriding any natural impulse to acknowledge the visitor. He had been taught that maintaining position was paramount, regardless of distractions or attempts to break his concentration. His commanding officer had emphasized this point repeatedly during training exercises designed to test their resolve. Growing increasingly frustrated, Trump took a step closer to the guard, now standing just arm's length away. His face began to redden slightly, a telltale sign that those who knew him well would recognize as mounting irritation. The former president was not accustomed to being ignored, especially by what he perceived as lower-ranking military personnel. The British protocol officer watched nervously from a few feet away, his hands clasped behind his back as he debated whether to intervene. He understood both the delicate nature of international relations and the absolute inflexibility of palace protocol. His position required him to balance respect for the visitor with adherence to centuries-old traditions that could not be compromised. Trump's security detail exchanged subtle glances, their professional training allowing them to communicate without words. They recognized the signs of their principal's growing agitation and began positioning themselves to manage any escalation of the situation. Their primary concern was maintaining Trump's safety and dignity while avoiding any international incidents. The young guard could sense the tension building around him but remained committed to his duties. His peripheral vision allowed him to observe the growing crowd of onlookers, including several palace staff members who had emerged from nearby entrances to witness the unfolding drama. The weight of their expectations added to his determination to uphold the standards of his position. Trump decided to take a more direct approach, believing that clear communication would resolve what he assumed was simply a misunderstanding. In his experience, most protocol issues could be resolved through assertive leadership and direct commands. He had successfully navigated complex international situations throughout his business career and presidency using similar tactics. "Soldier," Trump said in a firm voice, using the authoritative tone he had perfected during his time as commander-in-chief. The word carried the weight of his former office and the expectation of immediate compliance. He waited for the guard to respond with the military precision he had witnessed countless times in the White House. The guard's training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation. He had been instructed on how to handle attempts by visitors to engage him in conversation or to break his professional composure. His response was to maintain absolute stillness, allowing nothing to interfere with his duties to the crown. Several tourists had begun gathering at a respectful distance, their cameras ready to capture what appeared to be an interesting exchange between the former American president and the iconic British Palace Guard. The scene had all the elements of a memorable moment, though none of the observers could predict how it would unfold. Trump waited several seconds for a response that never came. The silence stretched uncomfortably as he realized his authority was not being acknowledged in the way he expected. His face showed a mixture of confusion and growing indignation as he processed this unexpected resistance to his commands. The palace staff members observing from nearby doorways began to murmur quietly among themselves. They had witnessed many unusual situations over the years, but this particular confrontation seemed to be heading toward uncharted territory. Their loyalty to the institution they served was absolute, regardless of the political status of any visiting dignitary. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting sharper shadows across the courtyard and highlighting the stark contrast between Trump's expensive business suit and the guard's traditional military uniform. The scene felt frozen in time, with both men representing different forms of authority and tradition that seemed fundamentally incompatible. The tension in the courtyard reached a breaking point as Trump raised his right hand in expectation, clearly anticipating the military salute he believed was his due. His gesture was confident and commanding, the same motion he had used countless times when reviewing troops or attending military ceremonies during his presidency. The expectation in his eyes was unmistakable. The palace guard's training kicked into high gear as he recognized what was happening. His instructors had covered this exact scenario during their extensive preparation courses, emphasizing that palace guards served only the British crown and owed no military courtesies to foreign dignitaries. Regardless of their former or current positions, Trump's raised hand remained steady as he waited for what he assumed would be an automatic response. In his mind, the principles of military respect transcended national boundaries, and he expected this young soldier to recognize the authority he had once wielded as the leader of America's armed forces. The seconds ticked by with agonizing slowness. The British protocol officer finally recognized that intervention was necessary. He had hoped the situation would resolve itself naturally, but it was becoming clear that both men were committed to their respective positions. His diplomatic training told him that allowing this standoff to continue would serve no one's interests. With measured steps, the protocol officer approached the two men, his face maintaining the neutral expression that years of diplomatic service had perfected. He understood that his next words would need to be carefully chosen to preserve everyone's dignity, while clarifying the situation that was rapidly becoming an international spectacle. The gathered tourists continued to document the scene with their smartphones and cameras, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Social media posts were already beginning to appear online, with hashtags and commentary spreading the story across multiple platforms. The palace staff quietly groaned as they realized this incident would likely make international headlines. Trump's security detail moved slightly closer, their professional instincts alerting them to the potential for public embarrassment or diplomatic complications. They had protected Trump through countless challenging situations, but this particular scenario required a delicate touch that went beyond their usual security protocols. The young guard remained absolutely motionless, his breathing steady and controlled despite the mounting pressure. His commitment to his duties was unwavering, and he drew strength from knowing that generations of palace guards before him had faced similar tests of their resolve and professionalism. "Mr. Trump," the protocol officer said softly, his voice carefully modulated to avoid attracting additional attention from the growing crowd of onlookers. His approach was respectful but firm, designed to address the situation without causing unnecessary embarrassment to anyone involved. Trump turned slightly toward the protocol officer while maintaining his expectant posture toward the guard. His expression showed a mixture of confusion and mounting frustration as he tried to understand why a simple military courtesy was proving so difficult to obtain. The situation was unlike anything he had experienced during his extensive travels and official visits. The protocol officer took a deep breath before continuing, knowing that his next words would either diffuse the tension or potentially escalate it further. His years of experience in handling delicate diplomatic situations had taught him the importance of choosing the right tone and approach for each unique circumstance. "Sir, I believe there may be some confusion about the protocols here at the palace," he said diplomatically. His words were chosen carefully to provide information without implying criticism of Trump's expectations or actions. The goal was to educate rather than embarrass. Though the distinction was admittedly subtle, the palace guard continued his stoic vigil, internally grateful for the intervention, but remaining committed to his post. His training had prepared him for exactly this type of situation, and he took pride in maintaining the standards that had been established over centuries of faithful service to the crown. Trump's hand began to lower slightly as he processed the protocol officer's words, though his expression suggested he was still not entirely convinced that the situation was being handled appropriately. His experience told him that respect for authority should be universal, regardless of location or circumstance. The protocol officer stepped closer to Trump, positioning himself at a respectful distance that would allow for private conversation while remaining visible to the growing crowd of observers. His diplomatic experience had taught him the importance of managing such situations with maximum discretion and minimum public spectacle. "Mr. Trump, the palace guards serve exclusively under the authority of Her Majesty the Queen and the British Crown," the protocol officer explained in measured tones. His voice carried the weight of centuries of tradition and protocol that could not be altered or compromised, regardless of the visitor's previous positions or expectations. Trump's expression shifted from confusion to surprise as the full implications of the protocol officer's words began to sink in. Throughout his presidency and business career, he had grown accustomed to military personnel recognizing his authority regardless of the setting or circumstances. This was his first encounter with a military organization that operated under completely different rules. The palace guard remained motionless throughout the explanation, his training allowing him to maintain perfect composure, even as he became the subject of an increasingly detailed discussion. His loyalty to the crown was absolute and unquestionable, having been instilled through months of rigorous preparation and reinforced through daily service. The crowd of tourists and palace staff continued to grow, with many people pulling out their phones to record what was becoming an unprecedented moment in diplomatic history. The scene had all the elements of a viral social media event, though none of the participants had intended to create such a spectacle. Trump lowered his hand completely, his face showing a mixture of understanding and lingering disbelief. The concept that his former authority as President of the United States carried no weight within the confines of Buckingham Palace was difficult for him to accept, given his extensive experience with international protocol and diplomatic courtesy. But surely, Trump began, his voice carrying a note of incredulity, there must be some recognition of my former office and the alliance between our nations. His words reflected a genuine belief that diplomatic relationships should translate into personal courtesies, especially given his previous interactions with British officials. The protocol officer nodded respectfully, acknowledging Trump's perspective while preparing to explain the nuances of British royal protocol that differed significantly from standard diplomatic practices. His role required him to educate without condescending, a delicate balance that years of experience had taught him to navigate carefully. Mr. Trump, while we certainly respect the office you formerly held and the relationship between our nations, the palace guards operate under a very specific set of protocols that have remained unchanged for centuries. The officer continued. His explanation was patient and thorough, designed to provide complete understanding of the situation. The young guard's thoughts remained focused on his duties, though he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in the traditions he represented. His service to the crown was more than just a job. It was a calling that connected him to generations of guards who had stood at their posts with the same unwavering dedication. Trump's security detail observed the exchange with professional interest, recognizing the educational value of understanding different protocol systems. Their own training had emphasized adaptability and cultural sensitivity, skills that were proving particularly relevant in this unique situation. The British protocol officer gestured subtly toward the palace entrance, suggesting that the conversation might be more appropriately continued in a less public setting. His diplomatic instincts told him that prolonging this discussion in front of growing crowds would serve no constructive purpose for anyone involved. These guards, the officer explained, take an oath of allegiance specifically to the crown, and their duties are defined entirely within that framework. They cannot and will not acknowledge any other authority, regardless of how distinguished or important that authority might be in other contexts. The weight of centuries of tradition seemed to settle over the courtyard as the explanation continued. The palace guard represented something that transcended individual personalities or political positions, embodying a continuity of service that had survived wars, revolutions, and the rise and fall of countless world leaders. Trump stood in contemplative silence for several long moments, processing the reality of his situation with the methodical approach he had developed through decades of complex business negotiations. The former president was not accustomed to having his authority questioned or limited, but he was beginning to understand that Buckingham Palace operated under rules that predated modern diplomatic conventions. The palace guard maintained his unwavering stance, internally grateful that the situation was being resolved through education rather than confrontation. His respect for the traditions he represented had only grown stronger during this unexpected test of his commitment and professionalism. The weight of his ceremonial rifle felt reassuring against his shoulder. The protocol officer watched Trump's face carefully, reading the subtle changes in expression that indicated the former president was genuinely trying to understand the unique nature of royal protocol. Years of diplomatic experience had taught him to recognize when someone was moving from resistance to acceptance of unfamiliar customs. "I appreciate the explanation," Trump said finally, his tone noticeably more subdued than it had been at the beginning of the encounter. The acknowledgement represented a significant moment of adaptation for someone who had spent years expecting immediate deference from military personnel worldwide. The crowd of onlookers began to sense that the tension was dissipating, though many continued recording in hopes of capturing any additional developments. The scene had already generated significant interest on social media platforms, with news outlets beginning to pick up the story from user-generated content. Trump's security detail relaxed slightly as they recognized the de-escalation of what could have become a more serious diplomatic incident. Their training had prepared them for various scenarios, but cultural protocol misunderstandings required a different type of management than traditional security threats. The young guard remained focused on his duties, though he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment at having maintained his standards under such unusual circumstances. His training had emphasized the importance of consistency and unwavering commitment, qualities that had served him well during this unexpected challenge. Perhaps, the protocol officer suggested diplomatically, we might continue your visit inside the palace, where the appropriate staff can provide you with a more comprehensive briefing on royal protocols and traditions. His suggestion was designed to redirect attention away from the public spectacle while offering Trump an opportunity to learn more about British customs. Trump nodded slowly, beginning to appreciate the complexity of the institution he was visiting. His business background had taught him to respect organizations with strong traditions and clear hierarchies, even when those structures differed significantly from his own experience and expectations. The protocol officer gestured toward the palace entrance, subtly indicating that the public portion of this educational moment had reached its natural conclusion. His diplomatic training emphasized the importance of allowing all parties to preserve their dignity while moving forward constructively. As Trump prepared to move toward the entrance, he paused and looked back at the palace guard one final time. The young man's dedication and professionalism had made a lasting impression, even though their interaction had not proceeded as the former president had initially expected. "That's quite a commitment you have there," Trump said to the guard, though he didn't expect a response. His words carried a note of genuine respect for the level of discipline and loyalty he had witnessed, qualities he had always valued in military personnel throughout his career. The palace guard's eyes remained fixed straight ahead, but there was a subtle shift in his bearing that suggested he had heard and appreciated the acknowledgement. His training prevented him from responding directly, but the recognition of his dedication was meaningful nonetheless. The morning sun continued to climb higher in the London sky, casting new patterns of light and shadow across the ancient stones of Buckingham Palace. The incident that had begun with confusion and frustration was ending with mutual understanding and respect, though the story would continue to generate discussion for days to come. As Trump's entourage moved toward the palace entrance, the former president found himself reflecting on the encounter with unexpected depth. His business career had taught him to value strong institutional cultures, and he was beginning to recognize that the palace guard's unwavering commitment represented exactly the type of loyalty and discipline he had always sought to cultivate in his own organizations. The protocol officer walked beside Trump, maintaining a respectful pace while remaining available to answer any additional questions about royal customs and traditions. His relief at the peaceful resolution of the situation was evident in his more relaxed demeanor, though he remained professionally alert to any potential complications. Behind them, the palace guard continued his vigil with renewed confidence. The encounter had tested his training in ways he had never anticipated, but his successful navigation of the situation had strengthened his understanding of his role and responsibilities. He felt a deeper connection to the centuries of tradition he represented. The crowd of tourists gradually began to disperse, though many continued to discuss what they had witnessed among themselves. The incident had provided them with a unique glimpse into the intersection of American political culture and British royal tradition, creating memories that would likely be shared for years to come. Trump's security detail conducted a brief debriefing among themselves as they walked, analyzing the situation for lessons that might apply to future international visits. Their professional development emphasized continuous learning from real-world scenarios, and this encounter had provided valuable insights into cultural protocol variations. Inside the palace, news of the courtyard incident had already reached senior staff members who were now preparing to provide Trump with a more comprehensive orientation to royal customs. Their approach would be educational rather than corrective, designed to enhance understanding while maintaining the dignity of all parties involved. The protocol officer began explaining some of the historical context behind the palace guard's strict adherence to royal protocol, helping Trump understand that the young man's behavior reflected centuries of tradition rather than any personal slight or disrespect toward visiting dignitaries. "The guards you see here today," the officer explained, as they walked through ornate corridors lined with portraits of British monarchs, represent an unbroken chain of service that extends back to the earliest days of the monarchy. Their loyalty is institutional rather than personal, which allows the crown to maintain consistency across generations and political changes. Trump listened with genuine interest, his business instincts recognizing the value of such institutional stability. Throughout his career, he had observed how organizations with strong foundational principles often outlasted those built around individual personalities or temporary circumstances. The conversation continued as they moved deeper into the palace, with the protocol officer providing insights into how royal protocol had evolved over centuries, while maintaining its core principles. Trump began to appreciate that his encounter with the guard had been a lesson in organizational culture rather than a personal rebuff. As they passed additional palace guards stationed throughout the building, Trump noticed that each maintained the same professional bearing and unwavering focus he had witnessed in the courtyard. The consistency was impressive and spoke to the effectiveness of their training and institutional culture. The protocol officer pointed out various architectural features and historical artifacts that demonstrated the continuity of royal tradition, helping Trump understand that the guards' behavior was part of a much larger system of customs and practices that had been refined over generations. The respect these guards show for their duties, the officer continued, extends far beyond individual interactions. They represent the stability and continuity of the crown itself, which requires them to maintain absolute consistency in their behavior and deportment. Trump found himself genuinely impressed by the level of institutional loyalty and commitment he was observing. His experience in building and managing large organizations had taught him to recognize quality when he saw it, and the palace guard system clearly represented an exceptionally well-developed approach to organizational culture and discipline. By the time Trump's visit concluded several hours later, he had gained a profound appreciation for the institutional culture that governed Buckingham Palace and its personnel. The educational tour had transformed his initial frustration into genuine respect for the traditions and protocols that maintained the stability of the British monarchy across centuries of political and social change. As he prepared to leave the palace, Trump made an unexpected request to return to the courtyard where his morning encounter had taken place. The protocol officer agreed, curious to see how the former president would handle a second interaction with the same guard who had maintained his post throughout the day. The young palace guard stood exactly as he had hours earlier, his uniform still immaculate and his bearing unchanged despite the long day of duty. His commitment to his responsibilities had never wavered. Even as news of the morning's incident had spread throughout the palace staff and generated considerable discussion, Trump approached the guard with a completely different demeanor than he had displayed earlier. Gone was the expectation of personal deference, replaced by a genuine appreciation for the young man's dedication to his duties and the institution he represented. The transformation was remarkable to witness. "I wanted to thank you," Trump said quietly, speaking to the guard without expecting any response. "Your commitment to your duties and your institution is exactly the kind of loyalty and professionalism that makes organizations truly great. I respect what you represent." The palace guard remained motionless, but there was something in his bearing that suggested he had heard and appreciated the acknowledgement. His training prevented any visible response, but the recognition of his dedication was meaningful nonetheless. The protocol officer observed this final interaction with satisfaction, recognizing that the day's events had achieved the best possible outcome. Both men had maintained their dignity, while learning something valuable about different approaches to authority, loyalty, and institutional service. As Trump's motorcade pulled away from Buckingham Palace, the former president reflected on how the encounter had challenged his assumptions about power and respect. The palace guard's unwavering commitment to his duties, regardless of external pressures or expectations, represented a form of strength that transcended individual personalities or political positions. The story of the incident spread rapidly through social media and news outlets, generating millions of views and countless discussions about cultural differences, institutional loyalty, and the nature of respect and authority. Many commentators noted how both Trump and the guard had ultimately demonstrated professionalism. Despite their fundamentally different perspectives, the young palace guard continued his duties that evening with a heightened sense of pride in his role and the traditions he upheld. The encounter had tested his training and commitment in unexpected ways, but his successful navigation of the situation had reinforced his understanding of his responsibilities and the importance of institutional loyalty. Palace staff members, who had witnessed the day's Events shared the story among themselves with a mixture of amusement and pride. The incident had demonstrated the resilience of their institutional culture and the effectiveness of their training programs in preparing personnel for even the most unusual circumstances. In the weeks that followed, the story became a case study in diplomatic protocol courses and military training programs, illustrating how different institutional cultures approach questions of authority, respect, and professional duty. The encounter had provided valuable lessons for anyone working in international relations or cross-cultural communication. Trump himself would later reflect on the incident during interviews and speeches, often using it as an example of how strong institutions maintain their integrity through consistent application of their principles. The palace guard's unwavering commitment had made a lasting impression that influenced his thinking about organizational culture and leadership. The story became part of both men's legacies in different ways. For Trump, it represented a moment of personal growth and cultural learning, while for the palace guard, it demonstrated the importance of maintaining professional standards, regardless of external pressures or celebrity encounters. Both had played their roles with ultimate dignity and professionalism,